And it's great to be here. And it's been such a wonderful experience just to see the community feeling at Proud, which I'm thrilled to be a part of. So speaking of community, if we haven't met yet, please feel free to come by afterwards, and I'd love to say hi, and I'd love to hear about you and what you're up to. So this morning, let's start by talking about something radical. Let's see. Is that working? Nope. Okay. We'll start by talking about something radical. And what we're going to talk about is why customer delight and chasing customer delight can go awry and what we need to do instead. Because the thing is, until now, what we've been hearing are these mantras of innovation. Right? We've learned that to build great products, to build successful products, we have to fail fast, learn fast, move fast, break things. And above all, what we've learned is we have to iterate quickly. Right? And this is conventional wisdom. This is how you're supposed to build products, by iterating quickly and by continuing to pivot and chasing customer delight. And if you do these things just right, then you stand to make successful products that make lots of money. Well, the problem is, it really is important to call bullshit on this. And I want to give you an example of why I say that this is bullshit and why we need to do something differently. And the example that I'm going to give you is that of a startup called Knack. So Paul was the entrepreneur who came to me, and he was telling me about his startup. So he had started this company called Knack, inspired by the suspended coffee movement, which, if you don't know what it is, by the way, it started about 100 years ago in Naples, where the idea is that you pay for 2 coffees, one that you consume, and the second is paid forward for someone who could use a random act of kindness. So he was inspired by this idea, and he built an app so that he could spread random acts of coffee. Now, when Paul came to me, he shared with me some of his numbers, and his numbers looked fantastic. Right? He had an excellent number of daily average users. He had even organic growth. People were spending tons of time on his app. Right? There was just one number that was telling me that things were wrong. It turned out that everyone was going to his app to claim a free coffee. No one was actually buying anyone a coffee. So there was no random acts of kindness happening on this app. So when Paul came to me, we diagnosed some product diseases. And what I found is that these product diseases are so easy to catch. And in fact, I've caught some of these product diseases myself. So let's do a checkup and tell me if you recognize some of these product diseases as I share kind of what Paul had encountered. It sounds like some of you are familiar with this one, obsessive sales disorder. So obsessive sales disorder happens when we say, we want to make our customers happy. We'll do anything to make our customers happy. And it sounds good, right? Except it doesn't quite work this way. So in Paul's case, he continued to try to make customers happy. And what they wanted was more free coffee. And so he was even spending his own money to fund these free coffees on this app. And the thing with obsessive sales disorder is that you tend to make your customers happy for the short time frame, but they're not happy in the long term. And it doesn't guarantee building successful products. You might be seeing obsessive sales disorder in your company in the form of maybe building custom features for your clients. Anyone see obsessive sales disorder? Thank you for sharing. Okay, this next disease is hypermetricemia. In this data-driven culture, right? And by the way, it's great to be data-driven only when you're measuring what is worth measuring. Hypermetricemia happens when we're obsessed with analytics and metrics and moving metrics and numbers all the way to the right, up and to the right. Except the problem is we sometimes don't think about what are the right metrics. And that was the example of Paul that I was telling you. He was measuring everything except the one metric that was telling me what was wrong. How many of us have seen hypermetricemia? Thank you for sharing. Okay, and then this next disease, narcissist complex. This one is so common, I have absolutely run into this. So the example of narcissist complex is when we are so focused on features and goals, what we need, that we become disconnected from what the customer actually needs. You know, in Paul's case, he felt like if he just had this feature to be able to buy someone a coffee, he would buy someone a coffee. And he figured if he would do that, others are going to do this too, right? How many of us have built features thinking if I had this, I would use it? Thank you, I've done this too. Okay, so these diseases, and there are others that I talk about in the book, Radical Product Thinking, they're such common diseases. And they happen when our iterations are not driven by a really clear vision and strategy. But to this, many people might say, but wait a minute, the whole point is to be agile, right? We're supposed to be lean and agile, and that's how you build great products. But the thing is, lean and agile, they're the equivalent of having a fast car. It's important to have a fast car, great. I mean, if you have a McLaren, good for you, right? It's wonderful to have a fast car. It helps you get to where you want to go faster. But the thing is, just being fast isn't important. There's more to it than that. You have to know where you're going. But to which one might say, wait a minute, that's where I use customer feedback. Just ask customers what they want, right? But the problem with that is asking customers for what they want. It's like asking for directions. It's like stopping in your fast car and asking, am I heading the right way? And so when you step back for a moment, what you realize is, before you get into your fast car and start driving, and before you stop and ask someone for directions, you are the driver. So you have to know where you're going and roughly how you're going to get there. Only then is it useful to drive fast or stop and ask for directions. And so this is why lean and agile, they're great. They give you speed, but when you only have speed, it looks like this. It looks like chaos, where everyone is moving wonderfully fast, but in different directions, unfortunately. And that's what leads to product diseases. So what we want instead is, we want to apply the lesson we learned in our high school physics class, right? We want not just speed, we want velocity. We want to add direction to our speed so that if we think about everyone in our organization like an arrow, we're all pointing in the same direction. And that's what gives us forward velocity. So this is where radical product thinking comes in. It's a methodology for building world-changing products, and it helps you bring everyone with you on the journey because it gives you the step-by-step process, a process for building these world-changing products. And in the radical product thinking way, you engineer change systematically by using these 5 elements. By starting with this clarity of what is the end state, the vision that you want to bring about. Then translating it into a very clear action plan or a strategy. Then into a set of priorities, then into execution and measurement, and finally into the culture your team needs. But you know, when I say this, it sounds like, oh, maybe this is a linear process, right? But the reality is that's not what I'm saying. Actually, product development is chaotic. You might go back and forth through these steps. But each of these steps are important milestones, markers for us to stay aligned as an organization. Because can you imagine, without those elements, right, this is what product development looks like. It looks like chaos. Now, at this point, I've talked to you about all these elements. You've heard these words, vision, strategy, priorities. And it would be a fair statement to say, okay, I've heard these words before. So tell me, what is radical? Because, of course, I know we need to have a good vision. I know we need to have a good strategy. But what's new about this? So this is where I want us to challenge conventional thinking about what is a good vision. And so I want to do an exercise with you. Let's do this live. Here's a vision statement. The kind of vision that you've heard is a good vision, right? It's broad, it sounds inspirational, it's short so your team can remember it. But there's a problem with this vision. This vision says contributing to human progress by empowering people to express themselves. And the problem with this vision is pretty much anything goes under this vision. Let's do this as an example. I'm going to give you an example of a product that can fall under this vision statement. And I want you to get creative with me. Think about a product that falls under this vision. And if you know the right answer, don't give me the right answer. I want you to get truly creative. Go wild. Exercise your creative juices here. So since I'm asking the question, I'll give you the example. My kids have a piano teacher. She is empowering my kids to express themselves and thereby contributing to human progress. So this could absolutely be my kids' piano teacher's vision. I'll give you another example. This could be the vision of a fashion brand because it's empowering people to express themselves. Anyone want to throw out ideas? Feel free. Selling fruits. There you go. You are creating human progress. They're eating well. Other ideas? Anyone? Social media? A company that makes stickers? Post-its? The problem with this is anything goes. And so what you need in a good vision is that you need the ability to hold up a feature against this vision and say, should I do this? And sometimes the answer should be, no, don't do it. So what we need to do is unlearn so much about what we've learned about what is a good vision. It is time. And so what we need in a good vision instead is, instead of these fluffy, broad statements, you need a detailed vision that answers the who, what, why, when, and how. Whose world are you trying to change? And it's not everyone. What exactly is their problem? And how are they solving this problem today? Then you can answer the question, why does this problem need to be solved? Because maybe it doesn't even need to be solved. Maybe the world is just fine the way it is. Then you can answer the question, when? When will you know that you've arrived? Meaning, when can you say mission accomplished? And then finally, this is finally where you're allowed to talk about your product. How? How is your product going to bring about this world that you envision? Now, what I've found is, even when you know that you have to answer the who, what, why, when, and how, if you start with a blank sheet of paper, you end up focusing just on the words. And focusing on the words is useless because you'll end up with a vision that sounds exactly like what you started with. So this is why we created this fill-in-the-blank statement to help you create the kind of vision that you really need for your team. Okay, let me actually show you how this works in practice. So in practice, how do we apply these elements at NAC to completely rethink the product? And I'll start with a vision, because we had to rethink the vision to really understand what's the change we were trying to bring about. So here's the radical vision statement we created for NAC. Today, when people who often go to coffee shops want to spread kindness around them or say thank you to someone, they have to remember to pay it forward and overcome awkwardness if they're paying for a stranger. This is unacceptable because it results in these acts being rare and not a habit. We envision a world where spreading kindness is easy and it becomes a habit for people. And the way we're bringing about this world is through an app that makes it easy to create random acts of kindness or random acts of coffee by buying someone a coffee to brighten their day. Now, this sounds more like an essay than the short slogan, but what's important for your team is to have such a detailed vision so that you can create alignment around these profound questions of who, what, why, when, and how. People need to be able to say the vision in their own words, not in your words, right? But having a clear vision is only the first step. Next, what you need is a detailed strategy. And so in the radical product thinking way, you create a radical strategy. And the mnemonic is RDCL, where the R stands for real pain points. And that means asking the question, what's the pain that makes someone come to your product? So in this case, right, people were coming to this product to claim the free coffee, but they were a little hesitant to buy someone a coffee because I don't know what that's going to feel like. Maybe I'll feel awkward. I don't want to spend my money not knowing what it's going to feel like to buy someone a coffee. And so the design is the solution to this pain point. So what's the solution we came up with? We said, okay, we need to get people to experience the joy of buying someone a coffee, but without having to pay for it first. So get them to experience this joy of giving someone a coffee, then we'll get them to learn how to pay for it. So to enable this design, since we didn't have infinite funding, that's where the capabilities comes in. This is the engine to power your design. So in terms of capabilities, Paul went and built partnerships with brands, so that brands would get behind this message of spreading random acts of kindness. And the brands allowed us to build this feature where each person got 2 coffees, one to consume and the second that they must gift to someone. Now, in terms of logistics, this is where we completely changed the business model. The business model became getting a percentage of the brand's sponsorship fees. Okay, so now we had a clear strategy. We had to think about our priorities. How will we put this in practice? And prioritization is where you think about how you balance vision against survival. I think of it as the yin and yang. You have to think about finding the balance of long-term against short-term. You know, a good product finds the right balance between this yin and yang. And so how did we do this, right? When you want to share this yin and yang with your team, help them see how you find this balance, you draw up this yin and yang on an X and Y axis. Your Y-axis is this good for the vision? And the X-axis is this helping you survive? Things that do both, well, great, those are the easy decisions. I call them ideal here, but really it's the easy decisions. You don't always just focus on easy. Sometimes you have to make the harder decisions, things that are investing in the vision because it's important for the vision, but it's not good for survival. You might be doing this in the form of fixing technical debt, or let's say doing user research. And the opposite of that is taking on vision debt. Remember I talked about obsessive sales disorder? That's when you take on too much vision debt because you're doing things for survival, like taking on custom features, but it's not good for the long-term vision. So how much vision debt are you going to take on? And so at NAC, how did we balance this? We started by actually investing in the vision. We had to completely change the code base. The code base was crap. So we had to start by investing in the vision. Then we built features in this ideal quadrant, the ability to gift 2 coffees, one to consume and one to gift. After that, we also had to build a feature for brands. Because if we wanted them to create these campaigns, well, they needed features to be able to monitor how their campaigns were doing, how many people were hearing about their brand through these coffees, right? So this wasn't great for the vision, but it was important for survival. So we took on a little bit of vision debt. And then we also built more investing in the vision by building the ability to take a payment. In the short term, taking a payment wasn't going to bring us too much revenue. We knew that our main source of revenue was actually going to be brands. But this was important to build because this was how we were training people to actually pay it forward. Okay, so now we've talked about vision, strategy, priorities. Now comes hypothesis-driven execution and measurement. This is where we overcome hypermetricemia. Instead of just measuring popular metrics and things like daily time spent on site, daily average users, etc., we want to create hypotheses to measure what matters. In this case, we said our hypothesis was, if we give users this ability to experience the joy of giving coffee without spending their own money, then the outcome we expect is that they'll buy someone a coffee. Why? Because they've experienced this joy of giving someone a coffee. Now, once you have a hypothesis, that's when you can start to measure metrics to validate this hypothesis. And you can think about it as leading and lagging metrics so that you get an early indicator of what's working. So in this case, in terms of leading indicators, we were looking at what percentage of people who are gifting the free coffee are now buying someone a coffee. Remember at the beginning I said 0% were spending their own money? Well, after this first try, 27% of people who are gifting free coffees were now all of a sudden buying someone a coffee. That's amazing, right? And then in terms of lagging indicators, this is where you can think about things like revenues. And eventually, are people actually buying someone, spreading random acts of kindness beyond coffee? So this is how we made NAC a radical product, one that's vision-driven and systematically creates change. Okay, now that I've given you this example of NAC, I really want to share an example that truly inspires me, because we can start to think about anything as a product when you apply this mindset. And the example that I want to give you is that of Singapore. Because I lived in Singapore for 2.5 years, and I was so amazed and inspired by how the entire country is built like a product. They apply product thinking to building a whole country. So let's look at the history of Singapore to really understand Singapore as a product. In the 1950s, Singapore was this poor island that was filled with disease, poverty. In fact, the majority of households didn't have running water or sanitation. This is an iconic picture from the 1950s where a man was carrying night soil, which is basically carrying poop because there was no sanitation, right? And from that to think that today Singapore is this economic powerhouse, you just imagine, like, how did they get here? Singapore was born out of being a failure of a merger. Singapore had actually merged with Malaysia, and it became an independent country in 1965 after a failed merger. And in fact, the first Prime Minister, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, he was tearful at the first press conference. He said, all my life, I thought Singapore's place belonged with Malaysia. But he had a vision for the country. He had a clarity of the change he wanted to bring about. And what's interesting to me is that he even talked about Singapore as a product. He described Singapore as wanting to produce a first world oasis in a third world region. He talked about it as a platform to explore the region. So businesses could come to this platform to explore the Asian region. It was fascinating that he talked about it like a product. But of course, at this point, we know that vision is only the first step. Then you need a radical strategy. So let's think about the pain points. What do businesses need in this oasis? The first thing was, and I won't go through all of this, I'll just go through one example. Businesses needed it to be really easy to communicate. So in terms of the solution, the answer was that English had to be the official language. But think about the fact that in Singapore, there were so many ethnicities and languages. You have Tamil, Malay, Chinese, and English. But English wasn't really big in Singapore at the time. So what did they do? The solution couldn't just be picking English as the official language. Think about civil wars in so many countries when you have so much diversity after colonialism. So what did they do? In terms of capabilities, they had to educate the whole population in terms of language. So English, they had to invest in English and training people. But on top of that, they didn't just discard the mother tongue languages. To this date, they teach these languages in school. In terms of priorities, they declared independence. That was investing in the vision. But then they had to do things in the ideal quadrant. They had to go build alliances and create an army. Because think about the fact that this was a tiny island that could have been gobbled up. Then they did more things that was in the ideal quadrant. Think about creating access to water. Singapore didn't even have access to water at the beginning. 70% of its water came from Malaysia. Today, Singapore's water mostly comes from the island. 30% only comes from Malaysia, and they're on track to being completely self-sufficient. Singapore was designed as a radical product that systematically translated vision into action. And so with this, I want to leave you with the thought that no matter in what area you want to create change, whether it's as a freelancer, whether it's as a researcher in a company, even in parenting or activism, in politics, whatever it is, you can create change very systematically by translating your vision into action. And so with that, if you'd like to learn more, you can get the Radical Product Thinking book. You can get the free toolkit on radicalproduct.com. You can ask me about workshops and consulting. And finally, you can also message me on LinkedIn. And lastly, we just launched Radical Product Thinking certification, so you're welcome to take a look at that as well. The next session starts on October 25th. Thank you. And with that, I'd love to take your questions. Thank you.
So, yes, we are taking questions. You can scan this and it will go to our Slido app, and from there I will be able to read Radhika her questions. I am curious though, while we wait for questions to come in, the President of Singapore, what do you believe is kind of like his biggest lesson learned?
Oh, you know, maybe, well, one thing, there are two lessons, I think. One is that in Singapore, whenever you go to any government agency, you see the vision described. And they actually apply this. So it's not just that the Prime Minister had a vision, that vision sort of cascaded into all the different ministries and how they apply things. So if I think about how that translates into us for products in our companies, you know, you need this high-level vision for your company, but then, or perhaps, you know, for at a product portfolio level, but then that vision has to cascade into every single product. Every single product needs a detailed vision that then aligns up to the portfolio vision and the company vision.
I'm also wondering, across the Radical framework, where do you find that practitioners tend to get stuck or tend to have the hardest time with their customers?
Yeah, great question. Also because I think this leads to this next question of, you know, how do I bring this into my company? I think that's probably the hardest part, because you might be here looking at all of this and say, I completely agree with you, but how do I bring this into my company? And there are two answers to this. Of course, change is easier top down. And so if you're the leader of a company, just take this and start with clarity of vision, bring your team into this, you know, that's much easier as a path. But what do you do if you're trying to bring this from a grassroots level? Sometimes it's hard to go in and say, okay, I think this vision is wrong, let's rethink this vision. And people will be like, well, who the hell are you to say this? And so the answer to that is, you know, I often use the vision versus survival, and then I use that to be able to start talking about priorities. If you're looking at agile sprints, as you do your sprint planning, look at vision versus survival. And that begs this next question of what's your vision? What's survival to you? And that's how you start going through the rest of the elements of radical product thinking.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience. How do you make sure you keep going towards your North Star while also solving customer requirements from sales that can't be mapped for all customers?
Yeah, great question. So sometimes, so the way I interpret this, right, is you can't always say no to customers. That maybe you have to win this mega deal, and the only way to win it is by taking on some custom feature. And so, if push comes to shove and you feel like you really have to do this, draw up vision versus survival as you talk to your sales team. And maybe you all agree that for you to survive, for you to maybe make your quarterly revenues, whatever that crucial reason is, you have to take on some vision debt. And so you say, okay, I'm going to take on this vision debt, but then the next question is, how much vision debt are we going to keep taking? And so we have to be thoughtful. One, acknowledge when you're taking on vision debt. If you don't acknowledge it, eventually vision debt builds up and your team feels like, you just don't care about the vision. You just don't care about the vision anymore. And so you want to avoid that and get people to acknowledge vision debt if you must take it on.
Okay, so the next question we have, how can you, as an individual contributor, evangelize these principles in a company where all the diseases you mentioned are daily business?
And so I think that's where you start with vision versus survival. And you start to infiltrate this at a grassroots level. Start to use this in various kinds of meetings. I mentioned using this in your agile sprint planning. You can use this with your development team. I start to use this with the sales team so that, if they're talking about adding all these custom features, you help build this idea of we're taking on vision debt. I start to use this with the executive team so that, as I'm pushing for features which require us to invest in the vision, because by the way, if we don't invest in our vision, over time our product deteriorates, right? If you don't invest, it deteriorates. And so use this with your executive team where you say, this is why we need to invest in the vision, what we're doing to invest in the vision. And so you use all of these approaches, even when you're communicating your strategy. As part of your strategic planning, don't just, write this fluffy strategic plan. I often see these fluffy two-page papers that go like, oh, we'll invest, $1 million and this will be the ROI. Instead, write a radical strategy in your strategic planning. By taking this grassroots approach, you spread this thinking slowly.
Thank you. Thank you. So yes, everyone, Radhika Dutt.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.